We're beginning now our unit on Aristotle, but before we jump into the material from the Nicomachean Ethics, I want to briefly discuss Aristotle's life, give a brief biography of Aristotle, what he did, what happened to him, what his impact on history was. And we're going to have a brief biography like this uh, for every philosopher that we read. I find that these kinds of things help contextualize the thinker a bit. They help put a face to these rather abstract ideas, and so can be a bit helpful for um, kind of going through their ideas and trying to understand them. Okay. So Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was born um, in a place called Stagira, which was to the north of Athens. So during Aristotle's life, Athens was kind of central Greek city, the most famous, I believe, most populous Greek city. He wasn't born there. He moved there later in life. We'll get to that in just a second. He was born in a kind of smaller city called Stagira that wasn't part of, I believe it was kind of off to the north. Um, it was seen as it was part of the kingdom of Macedon at the time, which will be important later. He was we don't know much about his early life at all, but judging from the work he later produced, he was obviously probably rather precocious. When he was about 18, so this would be around 366 BC, he moved to Athens and he enrolled at Plato's academy. So Plato is another very famous ancient Greek philosopher. Plato was an Athenian. I'm not going to be reading Plato in this class. Plato started what was, for all intents and purposes, the first institution of higher learning. It's called the academy. It's where we get that word that we use, the academy, academic, and so on. That word derives from the name of Plato's school, which was just named after the woods that it was near. We don't know exactly what went on at the academy. We don't know if they, had classes proper and exams and things like that. We just really don't know. What we do know is that it was very quickly, upon being founded, it became the center of the intellectual world. Mathematicians, scientists, philosophers, anybody interested in the life of the mind seemed to flock to Plato's school, and Aristotle was no exception. So when he's about 18, he travels to Athens, he moves to Athens and enrolls at Plato's academy, and he spends a long time there, nearly 20 years, over 20 years. He leaves when Plato dies. So Plato had been the head of the academy. So Plato is older, is a generation older than Aristotle. When Aristotle leaves when Plato dies, nobody knows quite why he left or what happened. Probably the most popular conjecture is that so Plato was the head of the academy, and Aristotle was quite clearly a very bright, promising student at the academy. When Plato dies, the conjecture is Aristotle thought he should, in some sense, inherit the academy. He should become the next head of the academy. Aristotle thought this. This is the conjecture. He doesn't, however. We know that he doesn't. Instead, it goes to Plato's nephew, right? So nepotism even back in the day. And people have conjectured that this is why Aristotle left. He felt snubbed, right? He by all rights deserved to become the next head of the academy, but instead it goes to Plato's nephew, something like that. So he leaves Athens and goes around the world engaging in scientific research, which we'll discuss in just a second. We also know that during Aristotle's life, he was invited. So, as I'd mentioned earlier, he was born in the city Stagira, which is part of the kingdom of Macedon. He was invited by King Philip II, who's a rather famous king. Well, top 50 most famous kings of all time, sure. But not necessarily a household name. But he's invited by King Philip II of Macedon to tutor King Philip's son. And King Philip's son is a household name. King Philip II's son was Alexander the Great. And Aristotle was Alexander the Great's teacher. He kind of tutored him. And one of the things, well, maybe you don't know this, but might strike you as curious, the New Testament of the Bible, like the Gospels, Paul's letters, they're all written in Greek. Why are they written in Greek? You know, these were written by Jewish people from the Middle East. Why are they writing in Greek of all things? Why aren't they writing in Hebrew or something, right? Well, the reason they're not can be traced back essentially to Aristotle via Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, of course, basically conquers a large chunk of the world, conquers the Middle East, conquers Greece, conquers Athens. Alexander the Great, though he was from Macedon, was a kind of, I'm not sure what the word for this would be, Grecophile. He was enamored with Greek culture. And this was probably in no small part because of the influence of Aristotle on him. Alexander the Great himself would speak Greek, and he spread the Greek language. He wanted to spread Greek culture across his empire. And that's why some few hundred years later, in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, people are speaking Greek. It's because Alexander the Great had spread that language and that culture across his empire. And so the New Testament is written in Greek. So in 338 BC, Alexander marches into Athens, and shortly thereafter, Aristotle returns to Athens. So in the meantime, so in between Plato's death and Aristotle's leaving the academy and Aristotle's return to Athens, Aristotle is, from what we can gather, was kind of exploring the world, if you will. He wasn't looking for new lands or anything like that. He was traveling around the Greek world, engaging in what we would call kind of scientific research, scientific investigation, observing animals and plants in particular, and making notes, writing things down. You know, there's this animal over there and it does this weird thing. There's this plant over here and it acts in this, or it, it grows in this bizarre way, and things like that. So extensive kind of biological research. 335 BC, he stops those kind of travels and he starts his own school in Athens called the Lyceum. The Lyceum was actually found 10, 15 years ago in ancient Greece. The ruins of it they were trying to build a parking lot somewhere. And they started digging down and, what do we have here? A bunch of ruins, a bunch of old stones. They bring in the archaeologists or whoever it is that would do this. And they determined that this was the Lyceum and that this, in fact, was where Aristotle had taught. And so now it's not a parking lot. They turned it into a museum. Parking lot's probably around the corner or something. I don't know. But you can go see the ruins of Aristotle's school. And there were other things at the Lyceum, too, not just his school. But I got to imagine that kind of thing happens quite often in ancient Greece. Anyways, he starts his own school in 335 BC. And from this point until more or less his death is when Aristotle writes basically everything that we have from Aristotle. This is when he starts putting pen to paper, so to speak. They didn't use paper and they didn't use pens. Obviously, they used wax tablets and like a kind of stylus to whatever. But this is when Aristotle starts writing. This is when, and we have right here's Aristotle's complete works, right? So it's about this big. Everything that Aristotle wrote that we have. There's a bunch that he wrote that we don't have, but this is all that we have from him. So he starts producing that in 335 BC. he produces a wide array of works, an impressively kind of expansive area of expertise. Um, he engages in many of the same investigations or disciplines that prior thinkers had. So investigation of the natural world in some sense or other had been going on for some time prior to Aristotle. Um, Aristotle picks that up and runs and does it even better, so to speak. Investigation into so something like physics, right? And Aristotle's got a work called the Physics, and investigation of the natural world in that sense. There had been theological reflection for some time prior to Aristotle, but Aristotle engages in that too. And in some sense, does it even better. Much more, or put it this way, it's much more sophisticated, his theological reflections, much more rigorous, systematic. He starts a number of disciplines on his own, though. So from what I was just talking about, these kind of traveling researches or whatever, when he's traveling around the world, he more or less single-handedly starts the field of biology. Aristotle is the first biologist. He's the first person to think that there is some sort of rational structure to biological nature that can be studied and known by human beings. And he's the first person to attempt to do that. And a number of Aristotle's works are actually these biological works. They're not as widely read as some of his other things, but he's the first biologist. He's also the first person to systematically study and write about logic. He wrote the first logical treatises that we have. And indeed, he even recognizes in those treatises that no one has ever written something like this before. And he says, that he's trying to do something new here. And logic is important for any number of reasons. It has very close ties to mathematics. If you get into mathematics much, you'll start, butting up against logic, and there are mathematical logic courses. Logic is also crucially important for computer science. If you get into, and I wouldn't know the details here, but you get into certain kinds of computer science, logic becomes very important. It's also just important for, it's highly important for philosophy, because logic is in certain ways sets the rules for argumentation, sets the rules for reasoning. So Aristotle is the first person to really establish this as a field. He writes on a bunch of other topics too. His philosophy of science. He writes a treatise called the Posterior Analytics that's concerned with how science ought to proceed, and it undoubtedly helped structure Euclid's geometry. You might have heard of Euclid. He kind of wrote the book on geometry, very literally. That book owed no small debt to Aristotle's Posterior Analytics. So anyway, so he writes all these things during this time. He writes the Nicomachean Ethics, which is what we're going to be reading during this time when he's in Athens at the Lyceum. So things are going just fine for, 10, 15 years or so. But then Alexander the Great dies, kind of very famously under suspect circumstances. I think there's a whole lot of stuff written on this, and I can't even remember what it is. I think people think he might have been poisoned. I don't know. You can go read about it. But Alexander the Great was not a particularly popular figure in Athens. Athens was they were famously proud of their freedom. They were the first democracy. And so when Alexander the Great comes and just takes them over, they're kind of, they don't like that so much. And so when Alexander the Great dies, there's a Athenian kind of uprising to throw off Macedonian rule. Now this guy's gone. Now we can have our freedom again. Aristotle, of course, is seen as an ally of Alexander the Great. He's from Macedon, Stagira, which is in Macedon. He tutored the guy. He comes in probably under Alexander's favor and starts up his own school. And so when Alexander the Great dies, Aristotle flees Athens. And indeed, there are stories, which I think are actually likely true, that there were threats upon Aristotle's life from the city of Athens proper at this time, and that they wanted to execute him. And if those of you familiar, right? So Aristotle was a student of Plato. Plato was, in a sense, it's tricky, he's in a sense a student of Socrates, who's another famous ancient Greek philosopher. And Socrates was very famously executed by the city of Athens. Well, when the story goes that when Aristotle was being threatened with execution, he said he wasn't going to let Athens sin against philosophy twice. He wasn't going to let them kill him too. They killed Socrates, not me too. And so Aristotle flees, and he dies shortly thereafter, 322 BC. Not from execution or anything, just it seems from the natural causes. He's not killed or anything like that. He just dies. Now, two things I want to talk about. So very briefly, we are going to, as I've already kind of indicated, Aristotle has this enormous impact on learning going forward. It starts biology, just starts it, starts the explicit study of logic. The impact that he had on subsequent learning and intellectual endeavor cannot be overstated. There was perhaps no more impactful thinker in the history of humanity than Aristotle. He set the paradigm for learning for roughly the next 1,800 years. When you read authors from the 1300s, for example, some 1,600 years after Aristotle, they still take Aristotle as an authority. They still begin their investigations, their thinking from Aristotelian starting points. And there are people today who still think that Aristotle, the system needs some modification here and there. There are some serious problems over there or over here or wherever. But more or less, the general system that Aristotle lays out is accurate, is the correct way of proceeding. So an immensely consequential figure. We are going to be reading one of his most influential and important works. It's called the Nicomachean Ethics. It's his work on ethics. It's called the Nicomachean Ethics. Why? Because that was the name of the editor of the work. Aristotle wrote two works called the Ethics. And so to differentiate them, later people called one of them after they named both of them after their respective editors. And so Nicomachus edited this one, and this other guy, Eudemus, edited the other one. So we have the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. And the Nicomachean Ethics is almost universally considered the more mature work. It's Aristotle's Ethics proper. And so we're going to try to get a sense of the ethical project that he's engaged in the ethics. We're going to look at some of the main ideas from that work. And the second thing I wanted to say is just very quickly about the Nicomachean Ethics. It's a difficult work. We think that it wasn't intended for publication, that it was rather kind of Aristotle's lecture notes. So Aristotle had a school, and from what we can gather, he would teach classes at it. And we think that that most of the works, most of the things in these two books here, are lecture notes from Aristotle. They weren't intended for publication. They were the notes he had for when he taught. And the Nicomachean Ethics is likewise thought to be that. That might explain, and to some degree, the kind of confusing nature of the text. Aristotle is not easy. He's probably the hardest thinker we're going to be reading this semester. Um, if they're just lecture notes, you might think he's not going to cross all the T's and dots all the I's, and that's why people have conjectured the Nicomachean Ethics and Aristotle's other works are kind of terse. They don't go into as much detail in certain places as you'd like, and they're kind of difficult reading. Now, that being said, the Nicomachean Ethics is probably among the most polished works from Aristotle's collected works. And there is a thread of argument going throughout the whole work. And we're not reading the whole work, but we're reading good chunks of it. And I'm going to attempt to show you what that thread is.